Thank you for tuning in. This is another episode of Chats with Pupil Progress. I'm here with the wonderful Shane Leaning, which I'm going to get him to introduce himself very shortly. Quick blurb as to what this is. This is me as a former senior leader in schools. I taught for 12 years, seeing the plethora of expertise and information that's available to us, particularly on LinkedIn, and actually going, well, why don't people know more about these people and what they offer and how they can move schools forward? So I'm super passionate about, learning about people like Shane, who's educational leadership expert, and why don't not more people know about his expertise and what he can do to support. So that is the premise, to actually have a conversation with these people. So without further ado, Shane, can you just give us a little bit of a backstory? Because I'd love you to talk a little bit about your recent book, which you launched last year, at the very end of last year, which is Change Starts Here. I'll give you the floor.
Oh, cheers, Brett. And what a pleasure it is to be on live with you. So yeah, for anyone listening, my name's Shane Leaning. I'm based in Shanghai in China. So I imagine many of your listeners, Brett, are in the UK, right? There's probably a decent base of them there. So I'm across the world in Shanghai, and I am the founder of an organization called Education Leaders, which is a podcast. I'm a keen podcaster. Brett, you've been on the podcast, a brilliant episode called Education Leaders. And that is my absolute passion. And Education Leaders is also a community of leaders around the world and an academy where I run leadership programs for leaders around the world and go into school to do consultancy and coaching work. In addition, on the side, I co-founded a not-for-profit called Work Collaborative with my brilliant colleague Ephraim Lerner, and that's how our book came about. Change Starts Here, and the whole idea around that is, how do we empower schools to lead confident change for themselves? So that's why it's Change Starts Here with you. That's the kind of call to action in the book. So with that kind of work, I do a lot of work with schools, looking at organizational change as an organizational coach on how they can move forward with change confidently and effectively, which is, as we'll probably uncover in this conversation, not actually that easy to get right.
Yeah, I mean, the link here is, we obviously we're a software company, and then it really piqued my interest when you released a blog and an article, and I think you did a podcast with someone on managing change. And I was just like, what a great conversation, because people that use our software, or it doesn't matter what change you're bringing in, it could be a behavior management change, it could be a new MIS, it could be and or both, it could be you're joining a new trust and there's a whole new cultural shift. And actually it made me think about, well, how, when we're doing these big changes, how many leaders out there are thinking about the actual pedagogy behind change management?
Yeah.
And can we open that conversation? Can we open that narrative and challenge people's thought process about what they think is the right or wrong way, or good ways to approach change? So that is the theme of this discussion, is actually change management. It's right in line with your philosophies and your education background. So the question that I want to start with actually is a really big one, which is, what is it that what do you think are the biggest mistakes that leaders make currently when they're trying to bring about big cultural or big change or big shifts within their schools? What do you think are the biggest mistakes that leaders are currently making, given your experience with working with these people?
Sure. So I think first I'd set this within a bit of a context, right? In that, for one, schools are constantly going through change. It's not something you can avoid, whether that's just small scale change that come from inside, or whether, like my friend Sharad Jiva says, it's asteroids hitting your school, like COVID, or like these big things that happen that kind of affect us. So, you're constantly going through change. The worrying thing about that, Brett, is that actually most change fails. Most. And in fact, like there's some good research on this. You could look back at some McKinsey studies that found 70% of change fails, like just doesn't last. And actually, you would extend that upwards. There's some great work by James Mannion, who wrote the book Making Change Stick, specifically for education. He would tell you probably way over 90% of change actually doesn't last past a couple of years. And listeners, like right now, are probably thinking, yeah, actually, if I was to list out some of those things that came in 2 years ago in my school, they're not going anymore. So I think first it's really important to note that most of the stuff that you're implementing right now won't last. That's quite depressing in a way. And I think there's lots of reasons why that happens. I'd love to go into a few, but I wonder, Brett, like does that kind of statistic kind of make sense to you a surprise?
No, I mean it's what this is exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because everyone's got this kind of idea of it, and then when you actually speak to someone who's done the research and is also a consultant in that space, you hear statistics like that make, you know, if no one ever learns anything more than from this session, that actually I can be a little bit kinder to myself, because statistically only 70%, only 30% of what we bring in is actually going to stick. Because my brain went immediately like, well, so why is that? And then I'm like, oh, actually, vice principal brings it in, is really driving it. It's nearly there, but then might leave. Head teacher is, you know, seconded to become an executive head in another school because they're failing and he's part of a 10 school trust. And then so that thing that he brought in is just going to kind of drift a bit, because so I'm just, it might, I mean, like, yeah, it resonates massively.
Well, let me pick up on a word you just said, actually, because I think that could be our key in, right? You just said that resonates massively. And I think something we talk about in our book, something that I do a lot of work on, is the idea of change having a resonance. And resonance is the thing that makes change really work. And a lack of resonance therefore makes it not work. So let me explain that. So when we think of the word resonate, we could maybe imagine like a Tibetan bowl, you know, like one of those singing bowls that you kind of load those metal bowls and you can hit the bowls and then make this really kind of long resonant sound. And when that bowl resonates, we say it resonates in three ways, right? First, when you hit it, you go ding, and it just keeps going through time. So firstly, you want any change to resonate through time. It needs to last, right? So that's, you know, kind of first rule of good change, is that it lasts through time. But secondly, there's another way we use the word resonance, which is when you hit that singing bowl, not only do you hear that sound for a while, but it makes physical vibrations into things around it, right? You can feel it on your hand there, and if it was on an object, it would resonate. Or I mean, certain frequencies with sound, the resonance can be so high you can break glass and stuff, right? So it vibrates the space around you. And I think that's the second rule of good change, is that it should resonate into the space, i.e. it's in the policies of the school. It feels like it's in the fabric, so that when that leader, like you just described, leaves, who started this change, it's not so much of an issue because it's embedded within the kind of the fabric of the school. And then the third one is the third meaning of resonance. And I would say this is the most important. It's the way you used it, actually, Brett, is you said that resonates with me. When you said that, like we often go, when we're listening to something that we feel something about, we often go resonates, and we even like touch our heart here, like that really resonates with me. And things that resonate with us as humans, we're more likely to invest in. I think so often change is done to staff and they don't connect with it in some way at some kind of human level. So it falls apart, because how do we really invest into something that we're not that passionate about? So I always think it's really nice to think about change in those three lenses. Think about resonance. I'm so glad you brought it up. But listeners, we didn't plan that. Like you just brought that up. And you resonate through time, you resonate through space, and you resonate through the people in your organizations. They should be the three checks you're always making when you're thinking about making change. And if any one of those is absent, your change is not likely to going to have the grounding it needs to really embed within your organization?
I feel like I'm learning, Shane. Forget the because do you know what? It's yeah, that's really I've been in a school recently, two schools recently where we're launching what we do. And actually, you know, I won't mention any names of schools or anything because they're everyone I've been into, wonderful places. But when I went in, we had a session planned, and it was like, I would like you to show them how to do this, 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 this. And I kind of like was on the drive, and I knew that the trust had bought this across to 10 schools. So my opening question, right, and the whole session, I'd like a 1 hour session plan. They wanted me to cover all these bullet points. And I basically sat in the room, and there was all of these senior leaders at a school because the trust had bought it. So I said, first off, straight off the bat, do you know why they've bought this software? Do you know why? And everyone kind of looked at each other, and one was like, yeah. And I said, okay, so who in this room doesn't actually really understand what this is going to do for them? And in a really healthy way, what is it that you don't understand as to why I've got to change what I currently do to bring this in?
Yeah.
That was it. What we'd planned for an hour just literally went out the window, and we spent an hour. So what then happened was they actually left the room going, oh, I understand it now. I get it. I get
Yes.
why we're changing, and I
Yeah.
get what it is that we're trying to do here. And therefore I'm also, and that all of those things that you talked about, resonance, which I never thought was coming out of this conversation, which is the time, the space, but then the big one there for me, because I can just relate to that personally, is the people. The people went, oh, okay, I understand it now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like, yeah, love it.
Well, I'm glad it resonates with you, Brett. And I think what I would add to that is that when most change fails, I think it usually comes down to one thing in my experience. And I work with a lot of schools and school groups around the world, specifically on this. So I see it fairly often. If we were to think about change, we could imagine it in 3 stages, really. Every change has 3 very distinct phases in the way that we conceptualize it, at least. Every change first starts with a perceived challenge, a perception. Someone has like some sort of perception of a challenge. Otherwise, why are you going to go on the change? Well, the funny thing is that you would hope everything starts with a perceived challenge that you're trying to solve. You'd be surprised at just how many things schools decide to do just because someone went to a conference, saw a cool tool and brought it back. Like, that's another story. But like every usually it would start with a challenge, right? And then at some point that perception, and it's always a perception, right? It's usually a perception of one person or something at the start. At some point that perception turns into a goal to say, this is what we want to achieve. This is the change we want to make. And then at some point that goal turns into a solution. So you've got a perception into a goal into a solution. The biggest issue with most change is that people jump so quickly from perception to solution, sometimes like that, sometimes literally like that. And a leader who's listening might like be thinking, sometimes that they do this where they go, oh, we've just seen reading scores are just not been good the last few years. We did a little data analysis and reading scores. Okay, so we need to improve our reading in year 1 and 2, for example. So one leader says, well, I think our phonics program isn't very good that we're using, so we should go with a new provider, and I think this one will work really well because I did it in my last school. Done. You've like gone straight to it. The problem is with that is that what you're going to then have to do is go on a campaign of what like people call in like the in the business world a campaign of buy-in, of generating buy-in from people. Like literally you're going to be in a constant place where you're going to have to go, I need to literally, I mean, even the word buy-in is a bit problematic to me because I'm literally going to have to go buy people into my way of thinking. And that's the, and this just rarely works very well. And I mean, it can work, and you can follow this. There are some established models, like by a guy called John Cotter, for example, that can help you move into this. But I would say there's an easier way into most change, and that is that you need to start a lot earlier on not getting people bought into a solution, but actually helping people to get aligned around a goal, around that goal first. And that a goal is very different to a solution. You know, a goal in the case of this one that I just gave an example, a goal there would be about improving the rate of of reading scores, for example, in years 1 and 2. Firstly, you want to know, do my teachers there, even first, have the same perception as me? Do they even agree that there's a reading challenge, or are they going to give you some different context on that that's going to help? Or maybe they do agree that there's a reading challenge and they say, yeah, we do need to work on this, but it's not necessarily a phonetic reading challenge. It's something else. Maybe there's something else that we're spotting. And ideally what you want to do is to craft a place where everyone is getting around a specific goal way before you're jumping to a solution. Because then once you've agreed the goal and everyone goes, okay, are we agreed on this is what we want to work on? People say yes. Then you can go, okay, let's look at some potential solutions. If you've done that work before, you're not going to then have to try and convince people of those solutions, because they already understand what the goal is. And so everyone is just going to be testing, does this achieve a goal, which is a really healthy way to lead through change. So often, though, leaders are in a point where they go, but I need to make the decision and then I need to get people on board. And that is, for me, where a lot of change falls down.
Yeah, do you know what? One thing that always springs to mind is also this is where it gets. You've opened a massive can of worms now.
Yeah, sorry, I'm quite good at that.
No, because here's the thing, right? Have you ever read a book called Surrounded by Idiots?
Oh, no, but I always see it, W.H. Smith at the airport, and I'm always like, I need to buy that. I reckon it's a great title.
Read it, right? Because what it basically talks about is just to chuck the grenade into this conversation, because I need to circle back to the word buy-in, because when you start to dissect the fact you are buying something, and it's almost like a transaction, and therefore
it is.
Well, if I've got to go backwards to buy, that's why we see, I've seen it with sometimes with the launch of our software. You're like, we haven't got that buy-in, and I'm like, well, what's not happened prior to mean that you've got to exhaust yourself trying to get buy-in.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Surrounded by Idiots is a fascinating read, because it does a lot of complex work or research. What it does is there's a huge amount of research about the different personality types and brain types within an organization, and then simplified it by giving people specific colors to the types of people they are, right? So red, green, yellow, and blue. I'm really glad I could remember the fourth color there, Shane. That was a real test of my intelligence. And no color is negative or positive, but every color in the book comes with indifference, negatives and positives. Okay. So for my, like, I'm as red can be, and there's major positives to that. There's major negatives to that. And there's also like certain people that I work really well with and not. And sometimes if you then know how you work with others that you sometimes don't, you can work better with them. So the whole premise of the book is actually to try and I'm just thinking about, because I know I've done these things in the past where I can, so here's the complexities. Sometimes I can see things and then I lose patience, because I'm seeing things that I'm going A to B on, which is like, I can see there's a problem. I can see that there's a potential solution, and I want to get from A to B as quick as possible. But then I've also got to, it's not being lazy, but you've then got to invest the time to actually say, well, like, do we even understand that there is a need for what we're doing?
Yes.
And like, because I've written down like the need, how much time do people spend on identifying that we all collectively agree there is a need here? And which then very directly links to that done to. well, actually, no, I can't see that there's a need here. Okay, we need to do some deeper work. And then there's a reflection as a leader is like, well, is there a need then? If there is like 90% of the room that thinks there's not a need after we've done some deep work on why I think there could be a need, I can go back and do the work myself to then go, let's hold the mirror up here. Like, I think there's a need. 90% of the room are like, guys, there's not, or Brett, like, there's not a need. Okay, cool.
Yes.
Like, I need to just relax a bit. Maybe we'll just let's subtract that. But then you might get like 50% of the room going, yeah, I'm with you, actually. I agree. And then the other 50% of the room might be like, oh, okay, like, yeah, well, actually, let me explore that a little bit more deeply. And then, so yeah, that is, I suppose my challenge to people listening is, how much time do you spend on identifying and getting agreement of that there is a need to change, versus how much time you spend on getting buy-in for the change you've already decided is going to happen, versus actually really just, is there a problem here, guys? Let's do the deep work. Because what you're suggesting, and this is a question for you, is change is likely to be more successful if we invest more heavily in identifying a need. And my assumption, again, is that you're going to have potentially a smoother journey in implementing the solutions if everyone's agreed that there is a problem we need to solve.
1,000% easier journey if that's where you're starting. Most changes just don't start with that. And you highlighted another thing that I think is really important, Brett, is that the perceived challenge, that the perceived challenge you have at the beginning is rarely the actual challenge. Rarely, when you start digging in, that initial perception you have is, I think this is a challenge, is rarely the actual challenge when you start to dig in with your community. In most of the schools I work with, we would identify a perceived challenge, then we would go to a phase of community discussions where we would be speaking with different stakeholders within the organization and working out what that challenge means to them. Often what will happen is we may totally change the challenge that we want to work on based on what's found. And at the very least, in pretty much every situation that I'm in, there is at least a tweak where they go, oh, I thought it was this. Actually, it's framed slightly. I can see that it needs framing slightly differently because we've unlocked a little bit of nuance here within the team. And then undoubtedly, because of those conversations that you're having, you end up with a much more confident start to the change where everyone goes, I get this, I get our why, and I get what we're trying to achieve. We've got it in a clear goal. And then everyone understands when you as a leader then have to go out and start looking for solutions, engaging with vendors or looking at the different options that you're going to, go forward with. Everyone goes, I get why they're doing that. And we've looked at what we want to achieve together. And in the end, to implement any change needs a community, right? Like, how many times have you seen, schools, if it is just, it'll be the same with you with Pupil Progress, right? If it's just the leader holding Pupil Progress and just kind of like pushing it down and just hoping for the best, it's going to have much more success if the community get behind it and understand the why of why we're using this and what its purpose is, and understand how powerful it can be. Then everyone can kind of start moving and growing that change and embedding that change in a resonant way. Is much more effective.
I mean, just listening to the kind of theme of this that's evolving quite organically is, by the way, I feel like I need to pin you for a second conversation at some point, because what I'm about to say is kind of setting us up for another conversation, which is,
well, fine, I'm happy with that.
Yeah. So what this is highlighting to me is, it's like, oh, what work are we doing? Like, is really proactive, right? Versus, how do we manage change? Well, what we're uncovering here from yourself is, well, actually, majority of things fail when we try to bring in change because we go to the top end really too quickly.
Yeah.
And we don't think about the foundational elements of change to get to where we want to get to. Because one of the things that I kind of had a poke around about, which could be a potential good discussion point, which leans into this, which the strategy versus culture. Because the thing that I'm listening to is how tuned in are we to the amount of change we've brought in over the last X period to then really start to understand, well, what's the current culture? What's the perception of staff? So, it's just, typical things that you'd have heard 100 times, 1,000 times, maybe shown in your work, which is, here's another thing that won't last, or getting, we've got to do another thing. And like, so it's actually, let's open that box a little bit around the strategy versus culture. And one of the key topics is trust between leadership and staff.
Yeah.
So what like, I've got some things I want to change, but then going even deeper, do our staff even trust that when we bring in something to change, it's actually going to stay and stick? And
yeah, that's right. Because I mean, each change that you bring in, you sometimes can have the kind of tendency to think this is just a new change and it operates independently. It doesn't. It operates within the culture of your school and within the culture of every change you've ever done, which is why actually I've got, if I take my book, our book off the shelf, and our book, by the way, it's like 40 questions that you ask going through a change process. And at the very beginning, like some of these first changes, like you might, if you didn't read the introduction and just flicked to the questions, you might be like, huh, like this doesn't seem, this is not relevant to me right now. I just need to get moving on the change. But actually, let me just load it up. There we go. I've got a list of questions here. There's, the first few questions in the book are things like asking, when was the last time your different people on your team felt heard, like on the team? Or what happens when people make mistakes? What happens when we've made mistakes in the past? What did we do? What did that look like? Or, how have we ever, what's the best disagreements we've ever had as a team before? And what happened when we disagreed well? Because, well, gosh, we really do know that change is really going to need that. And also, when have we done change well before? And when was the last change that we did that didn't last the year? What happened there? And really kind of evaluating our change landscape. And you will have a rich, complex change landscape. So important for you to really understand that and dig into that before you launch into any new change, because it's going to give you a lot of rich insights into how your organization actually moves that you can then start to build upon and go, oh, wow, well, I can see where this fell apart, and I think it was because X, Y, or Z. And so let's try and avoid that. Or maybe I can see where this change worked, and it was because we started small and we had that small group and they were really energetic about it and it rolled out. Wow, maybe we should build on that before. There's a lot of those answers within your walls already if you ask the right questions.
Like, so I can give, I mean, what a question. When was the best disagreement? I mean, what a question that is. That's a brilliant question. Feeling heard. I mean, that is, I mean, there's actually some there's some really good examples, or great examples. Shout out to Warden Park, a head teacher named Danwin Wilson. He was at Eastbourne Academy, and he wanted to bring our software in at Warden Park. And I just never forget. He was just like, look, I learned so much. I've come to a new school. There's a different culture, brilliant culture, slightly different to the one where I've just come from. I know how I need to roll this out. And he just went, I just need 3 subject areas. We're going to grow it to 5. And then in 7 months, we'll do a bit more of a launch. And then we've got an understanding of where in his words, he was like, we've got an understanding of why we are using this and what the need is. And then it becomes really obvious as to what the solution is. And now they've got, they're absolutely flying with the software and really love it. Now I'm sure he's had, I'm sure Dan is no Avenger. Apologies, Dan, if you're going to listen to this. Hopefully you will. But I'm sure he's had some change that hasn't worked. And therefore, it's like he's on that kind of learning journey. But to know and come back from, I've seen what happens if staff don't feel heard, if there is a culture of how much change has happened historically here, and what is the current voice. Because one of the things I wanted to touch on is, which I heard a lot, which I don't think has changed. When I was an assistant principal, excuse me, the middle leaders are absolutely critical in this equation.
Yeah.
because they're the group that ultimately are going to be adopting and driving whatever change is coming right at the coalface as a teacher,
Yeah.
as a school leader. So they're getting that top down, and then they've got to go and talk to the teachers and make sure that their behavior management's on point, as well as the classes they're teaching. So what I suppose, what comments do you have around learning discussion around what we've been talking about with middle leaders in mind, knowing that they are such a pivotal group in the kind of change management equation?
Yeah, I totally agree. For a start, like, middle leaders are the engine of the school in many ways, and sadly, I think in many schools around the world are just vastly under supported in their role, and used as kind of like, can be seen sometimes that middle leaders are just kind of like messengers who just need to take the message and pass the message and spread the message. And that is, that doesn't work. And most middle leaders will tell you that doesn't work. And that one of the biggest things that, I think a lot of middle leaders get frustrated with is when they're told to roll something out and they don't fully understand the rationale behind it, and yet they're having to do it. And a lot of times senior leaders will say this thing that always really annoys me: well, sometimes you have to deliver messages that you don't agree with. And I think there's sometimes a bit of a get out clause of a difficult conversation that needs to be had with that leader to work out what's happening and unpack that. Because if you've got a leader on your team who's like, oh, I really disagree, and you're asking them to roll out, and your response is, well, sometimes you just got to deliver stuff you don't agree with, then you should know that that message is not going to be delivered in the way it needs to be delivered to be effective. So actually, there's a conversation that needs to be had there. And a lot of the time, disagreement comes from a lack of, not from just disagreeing entirely, but from a lack of understanding of the why, and a lack of knowledge of how that decision has been made. And again, I think middle leaders need to be brought in way earlier into change processes to make this work. I mentioned a guy earlier, and I'd love to shout out to him, like James Mannion, Dr. James Mannion. He does a lot on implementation science in schools, and he talks about this idea of a slice team when you're creating a change, which is the idea that you take a slice through your organization and you could put a working party together. So and those working parties would be a mixture of the senior leaders, middle leaders, teachers, maybe assistants, maybe parents, maybe students, depending on the project, what it is. And that slice team is deeply involved in the thinking at every stage of this change, just so that you've always got that representation and that understanding across the board. What often happens is the opposite, where leaders make a decision and then it's a process of buy-in, isn't it, throughout all those different layers. Like they just need to get the middle leaders bought in, who then need to get their teachers bought in, who then need to get their students bought into the process. But every layer of that is a layer of confusion added, isn't it? Like, the message will never go through in the exact way you want it from the top. And then you end up in this situation as a leader where you get leaders who are generally saying, I don't understand. I sent the message out. I couldn't have been more clear in my meeting. Why isn't it not being done? I've said it, I've said it a million times, and they're still not doing it the way I wanted. Well, you have to reflect in that moment. Then it's because you're trying to communicate the change rather than actually share the change with your team. There's a big difference.
I love this. I've never heard slice team before.
Oh, it's a good one, isn't it? Yeah, I've got his.
That's such an incredible term, because the thing that I think about is this kind of microcosm of what is potentially to come. You can get a pretty good idea. So if you get that slice team together, and it's really ironic, actually. Well, not ironic. It's just interesting, because we've been advising schools, look, let's get this in the hands of your key stakeholders. Well, that is your slice team. It's who's going to be in that group. Well, it's going to be someone where they're under that level of deep scrutiny because they're they're the core subjects: English, math, science. Let's get some of the other subject areas in there that are your practical subjects that make, every subject is critical in the school outcomes. And then you've got within that the different types of qualifications. But let's get in that mix. Let's get a vice principal and assistant principal to see if they're at, and then from that slice team, you're going to see a huge insight as to some of the bigger problems that are going to come when you take this to a whole staff body. So I mean, what a wonderful strategy to say, right, well, who's my slice team that's going to start to show me all the potential pitfalls. Because within that team, you're guaranteed to have someone who's going to be going, have you seen all of these problems? You're guaranteed you're going to have someone who's going to be like, oh, have you seen all these possibilities? You're guaranteed to have people in that slice group that are going to be like, and actually, do you know what, on that as well, Shane, it's like, pick those people, pick the people that are the brilliant problem finders, pick the people that are the brilliant solution finders, pick the people that are not your compliant ones, but are really understand collective responsibility. So go, okay, yeah, I'm up for it. You want me to do that? I'm in. Let's go.
Totally. It's I think it is important to get those diverse voices. I was only on a panel the other day down in Hong Kong, and this panel was on how to scale innovation from a pilot project into kind of like full scale. And we were talking in that about the challenges of pilot projects sometimes being self-selected. Sometimes pilots have more energy because people are in a pilot and they're excited to be in it and they get to work it out, and sometimes, so therefore sometimes you can have this like positive bias in the pilot phase, and everything seems to work well because you've got the most energized people in your school having a go, and it was the people who wanted to do it in the first place. And then you roll it out and you go, why didn't it work like the pilot? And it's because you've rolled it out into a team of skeptics, into a team who don't understand that context, into a team who maybe aren't as excited by it.
I absolutely love it. And I think, do you know what, actually, I think the conversation has been really broad and there's a lot of depth here. And I'm just going to, I think, take the time to do some light summary, leave you with any final thoughts. You've definitely promised you're going to do another episode because your brain is brilliant, Shane. So we'll find a time in the next kind of maybe 2 to 3 months to follow up on this, because I'm sure, I know our audience would love to hear it, and I'd fall off my chair if your audience didn't want to hear it anyway. But the conversation has been about change management, things to look out for. The opening question was, what mistakes are leaders making? And then where the conversation's really gone is actually, what work are we doing to be really proactive and have the core foundations ready to change? This feels like this conversation has been really about, like, do we have the foundations ready to bring about change? Because we touched right at the start, that frightening statistic of actually only 70% of things, some research argues only 10%, so 30% of things actually stick. You opened with this brilliant word that we all know, but we don't use probably as much as what we think we would, which is resonance. And does the change, have we set it up to resonate through time, through the organization, the space, but most importantly, the people? Do the people feel, that hand on heart? Do they feel why we need this, and is it going to impact them? And then that brilliant conversation around culture versus strategy and the deep work that we've got to do. Are we even ready for change? Do we know what the temperature around change is within our school? Does everyone just literally reject change because so much change has not worked in the past? Have we evaluated what did and didn't work in the past? Like, have we actually gone back and gone, oh, that was really successful. Why was that successful? And then the last bit, that slice team, I think is what absolutely great call to action to go, if you've not taken anything else away from this, is like, oh, actually, you know what? Can we get a bit of eyes on what the future might look with a slice team of people that can show me where we might fall down if we went big with this too quickly, or are going to start to tease out some of the things that we're going to find a challenge. What a conversation, Shane. And anything else that you want to add at all? Any thoughts?
Well, no, I just loved this conversation. I can't wait for the next one. I agree. Most change fails because those foundations have not been set up. And it's why in most of my change work, sometimes people are looking for just like the steps for implementation. I've got those. We can work through those. There's much good work out there on implementation. But to be honest, you know, let's just focus on getting those foundations right. And then you can follow those steps later with so much more ease. You know, it really does make a huge difference.
Class. Last thing, where can people find Shane Leaning? Because not enough people know where you are. Where can they find you?
So you can find that Waterstones, Amazon, wherever you get your books. But most of my work lives at shaneleaning.com. So you can go there, you can ping me a message, you can have a look at the podcast on all the podcast players. That's Education Leaders. But yeah, if you go to shaneleaning.com, you'll get a good outline of some of the work I'm doing. So yeah, it would be great for you to reach out.
Amazing, Shane. Thank you for your time. I have loved this conversation. We're going to get it out to as many people as possible, and we'll definitely get you back in the diary. So thanks for your time. Amazing.
Thanks ever so much.
Shane, just quickly, do you mind repeating? Because for whatever reason, do you mind just repeating where we can find you? Because it went funny my end, and I want to make sure that the moment that people can find you, they can just go quiet. So
yeah,
I'll edit this, and then whoever's listening to this live, tell us.
Yeah, just go to shaneleaning.com. shaneleaning.com. You'll find all my information there, or if you want to just quickly find me, you mentioned LinkedIn at the beginning, so just search me on LinkedIn and send me a message there.
Amazing, Shane. Thanks so much for your time. Can't wait for the next one, mate.
A pleasure. Cheers, Brett.